Hi, it's Lynne Golodner, and welcome to the Make Meaning podcast. I'm a writer and entrepreneur, and through decades of writing articles for magazines and newspapers and authoring books, I've learned that we succeed through inspiration from storytelling and deep and mutually beneficial relationships. This show began in 2018 after my father was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and I wanted a way to capture his stories and record his insights. It's grown since then to share stories of how people around the world make meaning from very ordinary pursuits. Now I focus on sharing the stories of writers, authors, and those in the world of publishing to learn how and why we create stories that help us make meaning from the mundane. I'm a former journalist and marketing entrepreneur, and I've been teaching writing for more than 2 decades. As a writing coach, I help authors build their brands and share their words. I've had 8 books published already, and I just finished my second novel, so stay tuned for news about when and where you can read it. If you'd like to write with me, check out my offerings at lynnegolodner.com, and you'll find more episodes of this podcast at makemeaning.org, as well as on every podcast platform you can think of. If you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts. Thank you for tuning in to the Make Meaning podcast, where you'll find stories of courageous people daring to share their talent with the world. Now, on to the show. Tom Sleigh is the author of 11 books of poetry, most recently, The King's Touch. He has won numerous awards for his writing, including a $100,000 Kingsley Tufts Award and the John Updike Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, Virginia Quarterly Review, The Village Voice, The Best of the Best American Poetry, and so much more. A resident of Brooklyn, New York, Tom is a professor in the MFA program at Hunter College. He has also worked as a journalist in Syria, Lebanon, Somalia, Kenya, Iraq, and Libya. Today, Tom and I speak about how his early interest in anthropology and his travels to war zones and their aftermath informs his poetry. We discuss how to build a writing career, how to not be afraid of poetry, how to gain perspective and tell honest stories, and how writing is something you do every day. Tom, welcome to the Make Meaning podcast. So, hey, Tom, welcome to the Make Meaning podcast.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm glad we can finally do this.
Yeah, I'm so thrilled to have you on the show. I'm excited to talk with a fellow poet. And I want to say the first thing that intrigued me about you was that you are a journalist as well as a poet. And I like to say that I'm both as well, both my experiences in both genres. So I found that in my early days of being serious about my poetry, my journalistic skills really made themselves known in attention to detail and sometimes a reporting tone in my poems. So I wanted to start by asking you how your journalism and your poetry inform one another.
Well, that's interesting that you came at it from journalism going into the poetry, because I came at it from the complete opposite direction.
Uh-huh.
When I first started doing journalism, I had no idea what I was doing. Basically, it came about by happenstance, which is, a lot of how my life shapes itself. But in any case, what happened was I got invited to go to Lebanon and Syria, 2007, by a woman who was a Lebanese poet and her husband who was a Syrian poet. And their idea was they wanted to take writers, a handful of writers, over to Lebanon and Syria just to introduce them to Palestinian refugees in both Syria and Lebanon. Mm-hmm. As soon as we arrived, a kind of mini civil war broke out. And I was supposed to write something for a magazine, which I contracted before I left. And I had no idea what I was doing when I was it went a lot, but you show up and there are bombs going off everywhere and people are being shot, and it's an unofficial kind of civil war situation. That was there, luckily, with an old school journalist, probably like yourself, who basically saved me because, I had a notebook and a pencil and I felt really stupid. I've got a notebook, I've got a pencil. Well, what am I supposed to do with them? This guy was busily, taking down notes about everything. Nothing seemed to be happening. There he was taking notes. And after the second day of this, cards blowing up and whatnot, all these dramatic events, And, which of course, little Tommy boy had no idea what he got himself into. Immensely interesting, of course, deeply curious about what were the reasons for the sectarian violence, why was it happening, how it had transpired. And so I just said to my friend, so, I see you taking all these notes. What are you taking notes about?
Yeah.
And the first thing he said to me, Lynn, which may dovetail with your experience, he said, well, Tom, nobody is interested in your feelings. So don't take notes about what you're feeling. Take notes about what's happening right in front of you. Just descriptive, 3 or 4 words of a scene, so that when you get back, you can actually write up a scene, these notes, which are sort of help jog your memory.
Yeah.
And he said, you'll never know how insignificant a moment can suddenly become. And that's certainly what I discovered. I remember taking notes one night. I was watching television in my hotel room after a bunch of car bombs had gone off. And suddenly, an ad came on, and it was a really nice Mercedes.
Mm-hmm.
There were lots and lots of Mercedes in Beirut. In any case, it was a nice looking Mercedes, and there was a guy in a really nice leather jacket, and he had this little device in his hand. And I thought, a fancy door opener or something. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And then the voiceover came on, and it said, for a world of security.
Mm.
And what it was a device to sense whether or not there was plastic explosive that had been put underneath the wheel of his car.
Wow.
And it had all of the same, advertising tropes that we're all familiar with. Nice sweet music, except here it was, in this other weird context. And I suddenly realized, wow, that kind of encapsulates the situation in so many ways that go way beyond any kind of abstract, palaverite. And it gave you the texture of daily life suddenly in a way that was much more real for an outsider like me, like people who haven't been to Lebanon and Syria. Even though, I'm, sort of in the background, America has a huge responsibility for what's going on in those countries too. So that's how I came to it, Lynn. You were much smarter. I stumbled and bumbled and kind of figured it out.
Well, how do you go about writing your poetry? I would think that the curiosity, the noticing is the same, no?
It really is. I mean, I was amazed that what I couldn't do in journalism was I'm not a moralist. I don't like moralists, really. I'm not the way editorialists think is not how I think. If I have blood on my hands, I have blood on my hands. I don't want to stand on the mountaintop and orate at people and tell them what they should do and how they should think and all the rest of that. There are a lot of people out there who will do it.
Yeah.
And they do it better than I do. But what I learned from poetry, as I'm sure you know, from journalism and any of your poems, that I learned how to register details with a lot of that. And that's when I began to focus on the small stuff, not the big picture, but the small picture. I got utterly fascinated by blast waves, and suddenly the things that were happening to me on a small scale, like I met a tank, and I was only fascinated with the kind of communication that he had with his tank. He's underneath the tank and he's tapping on it and waiting for the sound that he's hearing back. And it was almost like he and the tank were talking. And those kinds of details began to, work their way into poems, even outlandish things like I had to go down to the South, do some interviews down there where the majority of the fighting had happened during the 2006 war between Lebanon and Israel. And so I wanted to go down there and see what had transpired there, what the situation was among local folk. And I had to get clearance to go down south. I remember going into this yard, military yard. It was like Sunday, hot as can be. And I got out of, the car and I was walking through the yard and there were a lot of tanks. And the tanks, when I say tanks, we have this idea of these monster American tanks. Now they're like just about the size of a horse and cart, these little French tanks. But in any case, I kept seeing this stuff moving around on top of the tanks, under the tanks, around the tanks. And I suddenly realized that there were feral cats, that there were hundreds of cats hanging around on the tanks. And that wouldn't happen in the US.
No.
I mean, maybe it would, but I doubt it. I don't think cats hang around. But anyway, there they were. And later on, I did write a poem about that. I wrote a poem about the tank mechanic. I mean, various things of that began to creep back into the work. And of course, when we've been doing this stuff for as long as I have, I saw a lot of suffering, just intense suffering, profound suffering, which I never would have come in contact with otherwise. And that really, really changed me as a human being. One of the things that I first thought when I was doing journalism was that I was going to need some kind of reliable point of view, that I was going to have to be, some kind of commentator, that I was going to have opinions. And, that's really not my thing. I don't. What I found, though, that I could do if I wasn't going to do, the kind of op-ed editorializing, do this, don't do that kind of thing, was that I could record with great accuracy the texture of everyday life, just normal, small interchanges. And it became, such an interesting way to proceed, because I suddenly felt a great weight lift off me about having to be an international journalist. And, and so one of the things that I began to think about was that no matter what else I did, the persona who wrote this stuff had to be completely upfront about the fact that there are lots of things that he didn't know. And so I tried to build that kind of perspective into the piece, as opposed to pretending that I was some kind of an instant expert. And naturally, because of that, I began to gravitate toward, really small, absurd details, just because that's how my mind tends to work. So, for example, I remember I think is really one of the kind of, highlights of civilization under the circumstances, I mean, being able to laugh at your own circumstances strikes me as being a really high order of civilized, way of thinking. And so what happened is I was dazzled by the sun, and I kept seeing these shadows which were moving in and out of the shadows of the tanks, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out what they were, until suddenly, I put my hand over my eyes and squinted hard, and suddenly I saw that there were hundreds of feral cats hanging around on top of the tanks and in the shadow, in the shade. And it was a very strange, juxtaposition of, just the ordinary. I mean, I'm a great cat lover, and there they were. I mean, again, it's the same thing as what I'm talking about in the earlier instance. It's just a moment of just the horrendous facts of war, and it is the horrendous facts of war, but at the same time, this kind of domestic intimacy. And in my experience, that's always been what's happened, is that the tragic and the ludicrous are always side by side, or the tragic and the intimate are always side by side.
Yeah. So tell me about the making of The King's Touch, your latest book of poetry. Tell me what inspired the title, the tone. I'd love to hear all about it.
Sure. Well, one thing I'll say about writers, and I'm sure you know this, Lynne, is they make up all kinds of shit. And explaining what they really were just flying by the seat of their pants.
Oh yeah. 100%. Yep.
So with that caveat, written 14 of them now, so I can't do anything else. They all kind of announce themselves differently when you go to put it together. In this particular book, the title comes from, and I'm sure it was sparked off in part by the circumstances of the pandemic. And it was also sparked off in part, I'm sure, by my own personal history with illness.
Okay.
And that is, when I was 26, I got diagnosed with a, potentially life-threatening blood disease. And, in those days, diagnosis to death was about 10 years.
Wow.
So, I thought I'd be dead by the time I was 34. Here I am. But what was weird, Lynne, was this. During all the years that I was ill, I felt very, very deeply a kind of estrangement from the person that I was when I was well. Because it really radically changed my life in a hurry. And the amount of sickness that I went through, and the hospitals and the transfusions and all of that, really separated me in a way from ordinary life. What happened was, I eventually had this way of just pursuing it by, what I call healthy denial, and just pretending to be well, and just going ahead with my life and doing what I could do within the parameters of the illness. Then the illness began to let up on me. But one thing that persisted was this deep sense of alienation, of separateness, of aloneness, of being isolated inside a body which looked normal to others, but was not normal. And eventually you just kind of grow around it. When COVID hit, suddenly this experience that I had had privately was like worldwide.
Yeah.
So suddenly when I had been experiencing, as this kind of, private condition, I suddenly saw, oh my God, everybody feels this kind of omnipresent fear now.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me is I had been reading, a few years back about, I'm kind of a nerd.
Aren't we all?
Writers.
Yep. Yeah.
I was reading a lot about, the history of, but I was reading about the history of the English monarchy, in particular, James I.
Okay.
And what was fascinating about James I, he later unified the throne of Scotland and England. And, but he was a strange guy. He was deeply into witches. And he wrote a book called Demonology.
Okay.
Just incredibly strange book.
Yeah.
Detailing all of the, various kinds of supernatural dangers in the kingdoms of Scotland and England and what you're supposed to do about them.
Okay.
And he did do things about them by burning people at the stake.
Of course.
The things that he had to do in relationship to this. In those days, there was something called the King's Evil.
Okay.
And the King's Evil was basically tuberculosis. It's a tuberculosis germ, but rather than infecting the lungs, it did infect the lungs, but it infected the skin.
Oh.
And so it created these terrible lesions, mainly, sometimes in the face, and these big open sores, these big ulcers.
Oh.
And part of the king's job, and it was a kind of hereditary thing that had been passed on for, many, many centuries, probably.
Yeah.
Was that the king, because he was the divinely anointed one of God, had the power of healing the sick by simply reaching out his hand and touching them. And the thing that I found deeply amusing about the king was he was horribly squeamish about being around sick people. But for political reasons, he had to hold these vast levees where, everybody lined up with their whole ulcers so that he would then have to, touch them.
Wow.
I mean, you're kind of epidemiologist nightmare, but there it is.
Yeah.
And I couldn't help but identify with all those commoners, waiting for the king's touch, to heal me. Why shouldn't the king's touch heal me? So that's where the title came from. And I felt in a way that when I came across it, that it sort of, it had an implication with a recent American president who also was a germaphobe.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it had I wanted to touch it lightly. I didn't want to do it heavy duty,
Yeah.
And at the same time, there was also the sense of something slightly miraculous, inexplicable by normal reason, and then these power that could be exerted in really kind of terrible ways, which I think in a way begins to speak to what happens in the first section of the book, which again comes out of some of the journalism, some of the experiences that I've had doing this kind of journalism about refugees over the last 15 years.
Okay. All right. What do you see as the main message you're trying to convey through this collection of poems?
Well, I think it's different than other collections because one of the things I think that's everywhere in the poems is just the recognition of my age. I'm 70, I just turned 70 recently. And there's a lot less time in front of me than there is behind me. And in a way, without being, kind of grandiose about it. It feels as if, that America is in one of these weird, kind of deeply polarized places, which is, kind of every journalist in the universe has said it. But in a deeper way than that, there's this philosopher named Teilhard de Chardin, whose philosophy has always greatly appealed to me. He was a soldier in the First World War, and he talked about just the spiritual intensity of being in battle. At the same time, he came up with this idea that the entire world was blanketed in human thought, and that human thought was a way of consolation. It was a way of solace. And so I began to think about that in terms of my own age and thinking, well, when I'm dead, nonetheless, human thought will be there. It's a different version of maybe of the King's Touch, the difference between this book and other books. I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a little valedictory. It's like, see you later, folks.
And you're probably going to have 5 more books before that time comes, right?
I doubt it.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. We'll make a bet. We'll see, and then we'll have you back on the show. So on a lighter note, I'd love to hear about your experiences as an expatriate immersed in other languages and how that inspired you to write in English. I know you've said, and I'm quoting, "I was extremely lonely for the sound of English." So I'd love to hear about those experiences.
When I was in my very early 20s, I think 21 years old, I was studying anthropology because anthropology seemed like such a wonderful, interesting way to live a life among people who are really quite different than you are and try to understand them in terms that they would recognize.
Mm-hmm.
But I very quickly learned the discipline of anthropology had nothing to do with that. I was hitchhiking to see my girlfriend. Yeah. And so I was hitchhiking between Los Angeles and California because I was going to go see my girlfriend. I was going to school in LA and I lived in San Diego. And I got picked up by a truck driver. Mm-hmm. I wasn't driving his truck. He began to tell me about how he'd just been down to southern Mexico, to a place called Chiapas, which is a southern state in Mexico, and to a place called San Cristobal de las Casas. He said he'd met the woman Gertrude Blom, Trudy Blom, who's a Swiss archaeologist and a brilliant photographer. Many of her photographs, or if not, sort of the majority of her photographs, are based on photographs that she took of the Lacandones, who live between Guatemala and Mexico and the selva, the jungle between those two countries. And in those days it was said, and I think it's a little more nuanced than that, but they were the most like the ancient Maya. And he gave her the address, and you just think how ridiculously unlikely such a thing is. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote to the address he gave me, and believe it or not, in 2 weeks later I got a letter back saying, wow, sure, we'd love to have you come down here. And the last sentence said, of course, you must be able to work under any possible conditions. So I got down there, and basically San Cristobal in those days didn't have electricity except during the day. So it was pitch black. And I came up to this really imposing house, knocked on this huge gate, knock, 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 like that. And these awful wolfhounds came bounding up to the gate, barking. And I was kind of like, oh my God, where the heck am I? This was what was called the Casa de Nabalón, House of the Jaguar. And this was a research center. And it also doubled as a hotel. And Trudy was an amazing person. Don't get me wrong. She was thoroughly admirable. She ran the thing, everything was always on a shoestring. And so we would get paid our wages on a Friday, and she would borrow them back from us on Monday.
Oh my God.
Really, that's just, we assumed, oh, sure, here. We were getting a room and board, and there was nothing to spend money on anyway. But in any case, I started working for Trudy. And I met lots and lots of anthropologists because they all came through the research center. I spoke Spanish all the time. Mm-hmm. And, when you're speaking Spanish all the time, I was quite a different person in Spanish than I was in English. It was kind of this nerdy, introspective, quiet fellow. And suddenly I was gesturing with my hands. I got lonely. I remember it was a wonderful moment. There was an anthropologist that I loved, very different than the other anthropologists. He didn't talk, jargon and shop, and he spoke perfect Mayan, just
Mm-hmm.
flew my mind. They were about 5'3", 5'2", very short, very, kind of, strong, solidly built. And Robert Bruce was about 6'6".
Mm.
And
Okay.
so there's really tall anthropologists, and these always sat next to each other at dinner, which was kind of it was like it was a long trestle table that came out of a movie about the Middle Ages. While you're all sitting there, like Trudy was dressed in a green bouquet gown, looking very, very, part of it was kitsch, part of it was, this kind of colonial, neo-colonial, status that Trudy sort of lived in, and was very easy to criticize, and was a little creepy at the same time. And at the same time, she was a real advocate for those folks, because if it hadn't been for Trudy, the timber companies, folks who were after minerals, they would have wiped the Lacandons out in a heartbeat. Robert Bruce invited me back to his room because he wanted me to help him bandage a little monkey that had fallen into the fire. Its paws had gotten burned. And so he wanted me to hold the monkey behind its neck with my fingers so that the monkey couldn't bite the heck out of him. And so he put the salve on the monkey's, hands, and then wrapped the gauze around them. And as he did it, he talked about the Mayan sacred book. And he did it in this language, it was English, but it was like a quasi-technical language, but it was also very down home. And I heard that language and I thought, oh my God, that's language like I've never heard it used. And then a few days later, I happened to be in the library at night, and a guy named Charles Bell showed up, and he began to talk. And he said, well, here, let me read you some poetry. And he took down from the shelves Tennyson down from the shelves, and he began to read The Lady of Shalott. I will never forget it. And he would get to the refrain. He would say this in a really exaggerated way. I am a weary, I wish that I were dead. I said, yeah, I can relate. And at that moment, just some kind of weird light bulb went on. And the very next day, I started writing stuff, vignette about Robert Bruce and the monkey. By the end of 3 months, I was just writing all the time, just taking all these notes, making these little portraits of all the people that I saw, quite a collection of eccentrics. And that's really how it happened. I was lonely for the sound of English, and then I had a different kind of English, and it put me in touch with that self, which I was, missing so badly.
Yeah. So was that the beginning of your poetry career, or had you written poetry younger? No?
I mean, no. My mother was a wonderful English teacher, very powerful English teacher, legendary, in fact, really quite legendary. And she, she took her life just this April. She was 97.
Oh,
and I remember.
So sorry.
Oh no, that's. I mean, wow, that's life, eh? And she, I remember being a little boy. And I remember her calling me into her room, and she began to read aloud to me from Walden by Thoreau. And it was a piece of Walden about the ant wars. And it was a total transformation of my mother, because she had gone from being my mother to this strange creature who was thoroughly enjoying the language. And basically what's going on is Thoreau is doing this kind of mock heroic description of these red and black ants who are in the most savage combat you can imagine, chewing each other's legs off and each other's heads off. And it has this kind of oddly humorous tone, even at the same time as it's, really gruesome. And there she was, thoroughly enjoying it. And she went immediately, from the category of mom to like the category of total weirdo. And I thought, wow, I'd never seen that in you.
Yeah.
And I said, I would really like that for myself. And I think that's when I really began to read a lot as a child. But I didn't really write until I had that, sense of estrangement.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I teach a lot of poetry. I write a lot of poetry, but so many people find poetry inaccessible or intimidating. And as a poet, I find that frustrating or sometimes maddening. I've had experiences where I'm in a few critique groups, and in one, I might be the only poet. And the first time I submitted a poem, the other writers were like, well, I don't really understand poetry, so I don't know if I can contribute, and it's like, no, that's a cop out. Like you can access poetry. It just might take a little effort, but so I wanted to ask you, what about the genre beckons to you? What do you love about poetry, about writing it, but also just sitting with it?
Well, it's just what you said, Lynn, sitting with it,
Yeah.
I mean, I love the quiet. Elizabeth Bishop, poet I really love, has that thing that, she says that the condition for appreciating, say, a poem is the same condition that you need for writing it. And that is what she calls a self-forgetful, perfectly useless concentration. And I love that description of it. And that's exactly what I experience. I mean, if somebody were asked me, you say, oh, well, you publish so many books, you must have a lot of discipline. I don't really have much discipline. But what I do have is I get a profound sense of pleasure from sitting by myself in a room and reading, and then suddenly a poem will start to come to me, and getting out of my own way and listening to what's in my head. And trying to get that down. And there's something so totally absorbing about it. When I'm writing a poem, I'm never bored. It's impossible to be bored. And I've come to the point where, whether or not it makes good poems, but the process of sitting quietly by myself is just really an essential thing that I've been able to squeeze out of my life.
Yeah.
And, it means that I don't spend a lot of time doing other things. But that's okay. I mean, I'm totally okay with that. And for me, the pleasure of it, if somebody were to say to me, oh, well, I don't really understand poetry, is say, I don't either. Honestly, I don't understand it either, pal. You say you don't understand it. If you slow your brain down, you'll have associations as you read it.
Yeah.
And that's the first step.
Yeah. You got to read it twice. I always tell people.
Yeah.
You got to close your eyes and listen to it and, sit with it, like you said.
Yeah. It's a sensual experience as opposed to a consumable experience.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I love about it too, Lynn. I'm sure you've had that experiences. Sometimes you're in the middle of writing a poem and you're thinking to yourself, I've never said anything like this before. Even like the fact that I'm thinking it is a little scary at times. And it's exciting, and it's a place of discovery. And even if you're writing badly, you don't know it until it's over with, and you get a great high out of it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure that. And maybe it is that, of course, I teach grad students. It's been a long time since I've taught folks who didn't have any desire, or that's not their world. But even with my dad, the least literary person on the face of the earth, he had a way of listening to a poem and then asking you, just really simple questions. I didn't really get what the bird was doing in it. And I would think,
I always, when I write something, I think it makes perfect sense. It is brilliant to me. And then when I share it with someone and they're like, I'm not getting this. I'm like, what are you talking about? It makes perfect sense. But, it's a process to write.
And that's part of it too. It's a process. It's deeply pleasurable to be in the place of writing is the most fun I have all day.
Yeah.
I mean, people talk about how tortured they are about writing, and true, one is stupider, or in my case, it's possible to be stupider today than it was yesterday, and stupider tomorrow.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really matter. It's not really about whether I'm stupid or not.
Right.
It's about something else that's just more profound. If it were just profound, it'd be pretentious and silly.
And it's about making sense of the world too, just figuring out what you think about things or what's happening,
a kind of provisional moment where you think, oh yeah, that makes sense to me, and then you come back to that 5 years later and it's something different.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's so nice to talk with a poet. And as our conversation comes to a close, I wonder if you might have any advice to aspiring writers who are listening about how do they build their writing career? What do they do? What's the path? Any kind of advice you might offer?
I remember I had an old friend, painter, and I would get all tangled up in my head about issues of career, the whole circus end of poetry, the publishing end of it, which of course is important, and everybody wants to have that validation, and me as well as anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking about it, and he just looked at me and said, "Don't get distracted." And I said, "Oh, okay, Benny, I get it. Don't get distracted." And by distracted, I just think he meant, like, if you let the world, I've been inside bubbles of taste,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been outside bubbles of taste.
Mm-hmm.
Like anybody who's been at this game for a long time, I've won things, and I've also lost things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I would say to somebody who's just starting out is to do the best you can to keep those things separate.
Mm-hmm.
The self-forgetful, perfectly useless concentration of sitting down and doing your work and feeling the pleasure in it and feeling a sense of discovery in it. And then the reception of the work is a completely different thing. And it's beyond your control, most of it.
Yeah.
You certainly try to send things out and whatnot, but if it comes back, that doesn't mean anything about the quality of it. It's just the capacity to fend off the sorts of bad thoughts one has about oneself, and I have them all the time. When you get rejected by somebody, those things aren't really what's happening when you're inside a home. Those things are the kinds of distractions that Benny was talking. I mean, that's what I would say to a younger writer. And the reason I can say it to a younger writer is because I say it to myself all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I always tell my students and the writers that I coach that, the business of writing is very different than the act of writing.
Yeah.
And I put them on different days because it's different energy and I can't do both. So I spend way more time writing than I do trying to get published or marketing. I do that, but it gets this much time because I want my life to be filled with writing. So
yeah, that's right. Exactly. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's wise the way you've split it up. I actually do it the same way. The words begin to come, and you don't judge them. You don't think about how they're going to be published or anything like that. And you just get into this other place in which you're just experiencing this kind of pure stream of concentration. And it's happiness to me.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. So, Tom, it has been such a pleasure to chat with you. I will be sharing in the show notes all of the links to buy your books and how to find you. And I'm just so delighted that I've had this chance to chat with you today. Thanks for being on the Make Meaning podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lynn. And good luck with your work. I'm sure you don't need it.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Make Meaning podcast with Lynne Golodner. You can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. If you like what you've heard, subscribe and share this episode with the meaningful people in your world. And please leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. You can learn more at makemeaning.org or lynnegolodner.com.